Okay, so today I'm going to go over the main parts of the brain, and you're going to fill in your handout that goes along with them. So, an interesting fact about the brain is that you have 100 billion neurons. We've already talked about this before, what neurons are. Remember, you have the dendrite, the soma, the axon terminal, and then what's the gap in between the neurons called? The synapse, or the synaptic gap. Good. So you have 100 billion of those neurons, and you don't have to write this down. This is just background information. To get to that number during gestation, which is the time that the baby develops in the mom's womb, you develop 250,000 neurons every minute. So that's a lot of brain activity. And what we know as of right now is in the brain, you will have as many cells as you will ever have. So you will lose brain cells, but what we know of brain cells right now is that you're not going to develop any more of them. So if your brain gets damaged, then there's something called neuroplasticity, where your brain can kind of figure out a different way of doing something, but it's not going to grow back. So think of like your hand. If for some reason somebody's hand was severed and they couldn't use it anymore, they're not going to grow a new hand, but they could figure out a new way to live without having their hand. Okay, so if part of your brain gets destroyed, you can't grow a new brain part back, but your brain can kind of rewire in a way to get better. Okay, so the first brain part you're going to write down is the brain stem. So it's this huge part, so I want you to color it in, and it has some different parts that we're going to go over. It's the oldest and central core of the brain. What we mean by the oldest is evolutionarily speaking. It's the oldest part of the brain. It begins where the spinal cord swells as it enters the skull. So it's kind of right back here. So as your spinal cord comes up into your brain, that's where your brain stem is. And it's responsible for our automatic survival functions. So think about things that we need to survive as a person. So breathing, heart rate, stuff like that, your brain stem is in charge of. Lots of animals also have a brain stem. Your dog has a brain stem. Apes have a brain stem. Dolphins have a brain stem. So it's this part of the brain that allows us to survive. This keeps our heart rate going. Think about how we would not be able to function if we always had to tell ourselves, keep breathing, heart keep beating. It doesn't work like that. We have the brain stem that does that for us. So we're going to look at the different parts of the brain stem, but this as a whole, its job is for automatic survival functions. Okay, so the first part of the brain stem is called the medulla. So it's right down here, your medulla, and it controls your heartbeat and your breathing. So you have the brain stem here. I want you to color in the medulla on your paper. So that's this part right here at the base of the brain stem. So it's called the medulla, or the medulla oblongata is the long name for it. And it controls your heartbeat and your breathing. So if somebody takes too much of a particular drug, that drug can flood this part of the brain, and the person will have a heart attack and die. Okay, so drugs can particularly affect this part of the brain. If your medulla is damaged, that means that your heart will stop beating or you'll stop breathing. So this part of the brain cannot be damaged, and really, if it's destroyed, then the person will not survive. Okay, the long name for it is medulla oblongata. They reference it in the movie The Waterboy. Have you ever seen that movie? It's kind of an old movie now. It's an old football movie. So they reference it in that movie. It's my son's middle name, Benjamin Medulla Oblongata. I'm just kidding. That's not his middle name. But it's the whole name of it is medulla oblongata. But you can just call it the medulla. Okay? All right, next. I'm so glad that joke is on our video forever now. You have the pons. Okay, the pons is just above the medulla. So color it in, the pons. It helps with movement, and it also helps with sleep and arousal. So I want you to underline the word sleep because it really helps with sleep. By arousal, we're not referring to sexual arousal. We're talking about being awake, being aware of what's going on, that type of arousal. It also helps with dreams and facial expressions. What we learned about yesterday is that the right hemisphere is really good for facial expressions, but the pons can also help with that. So remember, we're still in the brainstem, which is this part that comes up into the brain, but it's this one section of the brain called the pons. And you colored it in on your paper. Good. All right, this is a CAT scan of the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. So remember we talked about ways of studying the brain 2 days ago. So you can see coming up in here, so this is the brainstem right here. So you're going to have the medulla and the pons are right here. This is the cerebellum, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then up here are the lobes, or your hemispheres of your brain. So your hemisphere, your right hemisphere, your left hemisphere of your brain. What's this part called right here? Do you remember from yesterday?
The corpus callosum.
Very good. The corpus callosum, which connects your left and right hemispheres. Okay. What happens if you break a brain scanner? It's a catastrophe. I'm so glad we have this on video. Okay, next one. So, next you have your reticular formation. So, your reticular formation is this neural network that's inside the brainstem. So here you have your medulla, your pons that we just talked about. You have your reticular formation, which is a network of neurons through that region. So go ahead and color that in. So it comes up through the brainstem. Sometimes they call it the reticular activating system. If you see the word reticular, just know it's referring to this part. What this part does is it controls arousal. If a person damages this part of their brain, they will lapse into a coma and never wake up. Okay, so all the other parts of the brain can be fine, but if this part gets damaged, they'll never wake up from a coma, ever. So think about it. A good analogy would be that if you're in a house and everything in the house is working and people are talking and everybody is moving, the reticular formation is kind of like the doorbell ringer. If the doorbell ringer is not connected, then nobody's ever going to come to the door to see who's there. So the same idea as with the brain. All the other parts of the brain can be working, but if this doesn't work, then nobody's going to wake up. Nobody's going to know that you're there. They did an experiment where they severed this, they cut this in half on cats, and the cats lapsed into a coma. Okay. All right, next you have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is known as the little brain. This is a sliced view. So this is if you took somebody's head like this and chopped it in half down the middle, like that. That's what the cerebellum looks like if it's cut in half. Can you go to the next slide and then we'll come back to this one? Yeah, this is what it looks like whole down here. So this is the cerebellum. So this is a side view, and then the previous slide is if we cut it in half. So we can go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So this is what it looks like cut in half. The cerebellum is known as the little brain because it's small down here compared to your big hemispheres of your brain up there. So you have your hemispheres of your brain like this, and then the cerebellum is below it. It helps with movement and balance. It's really affected by alcohol, which is why sometimes if people get intoxicated when they're walking, they kind of stumble around because their cerebellum has been affected. It's also why one of the reasons why people should not operate a motor vehicle. They shouldn't drive a car or operate any kind of machinery if they've been drinking because their movements and balance have been affected. Your ability to stand on one foot and then the other is because of your cerebellum. So it helps you with movement. Okay? Now, we just went over 4 or 5. 5? 5. So take a minute and review with your table. Every person needs to talk